We are kind of in the home stretch of our study of the second part of Hebrews. And so I hope that you're pressing on, and I hope that you're continuing to be diligent with your work at home, so that when we come together, I see you're here, obviously, so you're being diligent in that, but I hope that this time is beneficial. And so this past week has kind of been in the weeds, so to speak. It's been one of those very, very detailed, not a whole lot of people know all about the tabernacle, right? It's not a foundational, as soon as you hear the gospel, you've got to find out about the tabernacle kind of study, right? So it's kind of been an in the weeds thing. And so we're going to be in those weeds this morning as we discuss our lesson, but I don't want us to lose sight of the context and where we're going in this book of Hebrews. So let's just do a small review. It's going to be a different review. Then I'm not going to ask you all the same questions since Carolyn's not here to give all of the right answers. By the way, she's not feeling well again. She's on her second round of antibiotics and a steroid, and she's just still not ready. But she's hoping to be here next week, so just keep praying for her. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of review, and that's going to settle us into the context of what we've been talking about in Hebrews, and then we're going to stroll right into the knee-high stuff, okay? The knee-high weeds. All right, you'll remember that the focus of last week's lesson was the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And at the base level, just the very, very basic, the author of Hebrews is trying to show the recipients one thing about the difference between the old and the new. What would you say that just very most basic thing he's trying to show them is?
It's better.
It's better. That's right. That's what we talked about last week. We wanted to discover last week in our discussion, do we agree with him that it's better? Did we agree with him that it's better? Absolutely. So that's just base level. It's better. And he says that in chapter 8, verse 6. He says that it is a better covenant enacted on better promises. Now, what happened to the first one? Wasn't it good enough? Was there something wrong with the covenant?
It's based on the law.
Right, there's nothing wrong with it, but it was
based on the people obeying.
Right, it's based on the people obeying. And what happened?
They didn't.
They didn't obey, right? There's nothing wrong with the covenant. There's nothing wrong with the God who made it, right? But there was something wrong with the people who he entered into covenant with. And since they were disobedient, it was considered, he found fault in them, right? And that was chapter 8, verse 8, saying, it says, finding fault with them, right? It's finding fault in them. And it's, again, not with the covenant, not with the God who made it, but with the people who were involved in it. And who was it that was involved in the first covenant?
The
Israelites.
Out of Egypt.
And they're referred to as a house, or two houses.
Israel and Judah.
Right, the house of Israel, the house of Judah, and then they are made covenant partners with who?
With God.
With God. And in its very basic terms, what were the conditions of the first covenant? Just not like all the details and all of
They
it.
obey.
Right. So if they obey, what will happen?
Blessing.
Blessing. And if they disobey, what will happen? Right. And so since they did the second part of it, what did they receive? Right. He promised that they would receive that if they were disobedient in this covenant. And so they go off, and we have the history of the Old Testament, right? Okay, so what did God promise after the covenant and after they broke the covenant, and even indeed while they were in the punishment phase of this covenant? What did he promise them to the prophets?
A new covenant.
A new covenant. And so we get this beautiful, glorious covenant. Now, what makes the new covenant different?
We have a better high priest.
We have a better high priest.
And it's unconditional.
It's unconditional, right? So who's entering into this covenant? Back then it was the house of Israel, house of Judah. Who's entering into this new covenant? Who does he promise it to?
Gentiles. All believers.
Who does he promise it to? This is the promises from the
Well, the
prophets.
promises to the house of Israel.
Right, so he says, I will to the house of Israel, the house of Judah, I will bring them into, and I'll bring them back. And what will he do to them? Do you remember that?
Give them a heart.
Right, so
Yeah.
whereas the law was written on
On
stone
stone.
and, and in front of them, right? Now it is where?
Within their heart.
Within their hearts, within their minds. Now, there was a mystery that was associated with this covenant. And that's where you guys were ready to jump in because you wanted to be part of it, right? Right? Okay, so there's a mystery associated with the covenant. What was the mystery that these prophets, when he gave them this word, they didn't understand, that was then revealed in the New Testament?
That the Gentiles would be grafted into.
Right, that they get those promises too, that they get to enter into this new covenant. Now, how is this covenant made?
Through Christ's blood.
Through Christ's blood, right? And without the shedding of blood, there can be no
No
forgiveness of
forgiveness.
sins. And there also is no covenant, right?
Right.
That the blood is what cuts the covenant, right? That is how we enter into it. So by the blood of Christ, not only is the house of Judah and the house of Israel brought in, but the mystery that the Gentiles are brought in. So we have this beautiful, wonderful, isn't it better? Don't we agree with him? It's better, right? And it's what kind of covenant? You said unconditional, but it's also
Eternal.
eternal, everlasting, forever. This covenant is better in that sense because the old one, now that the new one has been brought in, what does it say? What does the author of Hebrews say about the old covenant?
It's ready to disappear.
It's ready to disappear, right? And so we see that goes away. Okay, do you remember that the author of Hebrews, he's trying to get the recipient's eyes back on Jesus. And he presented these two covenants, and he shows how the second is better than the first. And did we agree with him?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Now, having dealt with the particulars of this better and new covenant, the author then returns to a discussion that he started right at the beginning of chapter 8. So we're going to go to chapter 8, and we're going to look at those first couple of verses. Do you remember that he did kind of a summing up of the whole book so far? Because he says right at the beginning of chapter 8. Now, the main point of what has been said is this. So if we kind of got lost in the weeds somewhere along the way, he's like, let me focus you back in. We have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched, not man. And so we see there's this mention of this true tabernacle, right? Now, what I just reviewed with you is actually Hebrews 8:6 through 13, right? That's where he talks about that. So when he gets to chapter 9, he returns back to talking about that true tabernacle, right? So that's what I'm saying. He kind of digressed a little bit. It talked about this old covenant, new covenant, and the fact that Jesus is the mediator of this new covenant. And then he returns and he talks about the first covenant having regulations of divine worship and the earthly tabernacle. So he comes back to that tabernacle. Now, let's find out what he said about it in chapter 8. What did he say about the tabernacle in Hebrews 8?
The first one or the?
Well, did you mark the word tabernacle?
Yeah.
Okay. So what does he refer to there?
The outer one that's prepared by hands, earthly, temporary?
Oh, wait, no, in chapter 8. Chapter 8, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It says that Jesus, right, this high priest Jesus in verse 2 is a minister in the sanctuary and in the what?
True tabernacle.
The true tabernacle, which what?
The Lord.
Yeah, not man. And then it goes on and you find it again, the word tabernacle, in verse 5. who serve, and it's talking about the priests who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, just as Moses was warned by God when he was about to erect the tabernacle. Which tabernacle would he be talking about here?
The one made by man.
Right, the one made by man. And so what did God tell him to do, according to verse 5?
To make it according to the pattern that he was shown.
Okay, so he's showing him a pattern. What would you think he'd be showing him, according to verse 2?
True.
The true tabernacle. So he's saying, make it according to this true tabernacle. And so we see that there are 2 tabernacles. Wait, there were 2 covenants. Now there's 2 tabernacles. There's been a whole lot of comparisons in this book, hasn't there? I mean, there's just been one right after the other, right after the other, because remember, part of the theme of the book of Hebrews is to get their eyes off of the old and back onto Jesus. Consider Jesus our great high priest, that we don't go back to those earthly high priests, but that we place all our faith, all of everything we have, all of our hope on him, right? Okay, so he's also talked about Jesus as a better high priest. And that better high priest, he's serving in this heavenly tabernacle, this true tabernacle. In 6:19, he tells us that it's within the veil. And then in 6:20, he tells us that he is a priest forever according to the
Order
of Melchizedek. And he says that again in 7:17. And then he tells us that Jesus is a high priest in this true tabernacle, in this heavenly tabernacle, according to the oath of God. So he's promised, right? He's promised this priesthood. And that's in 7:20 and 21. And then not just that, but as high priest, he is also the guarantee of a better covenant, and that's 7:22. Then he tells us in 7:24 that he lives forever and he continues forever in his high priestly role. Then he tells us that he always lives to make intercession for those who draw near to God through him. That's 7:25. And then he tells us that this priesthood is perfect forever. That's 7:26 and 28, right? And then he presented him as the mediator of this better covenant. And that's what we talked about last week, that comparison of the old covenant and the new covenant being better. That's Hebrews 8:6 through 13. And having discussed the what of Jesus' ministry, the particulars of his qualifications, and the work he has done and continues to do, the author then turns to discuss the where, right? We're always observing who, what, when, where. This is where he starts to talk about where. And we looked at that in chapters 9 and 10. All of chapter 9 and then part of chapter 10 this last week. And as he's been doing all along, he's going to compare the old with the new, right? We're going to see another comparison. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at these tabernacles. And we're going to settle in our minds and in our hearts which one we would choose, right? Would we choose the first, or and the old, or would we choose the better, right? Are we going to call it better? Are we going to agree with the author of Hebrews that this is a better one? So, what I thought we would do, because I love to do this, we're going to make some lists, and we're going to look at, when you were reading chapters 9 and 10, because they had us read chapters 9 and 10 and do our observation worksheets. While you were doing your observation worksheets, did you mark tabernacle? Mm-hmm. Did you mark them distinctly, or did it kind of come out to you to mark them distinctly, or did you do them all one? Because there was a distinction in chapter 9.
First tabernacle.
Right, and then the heavenly one. So there's almost 3 distinctions. The first is the regular tabernacle. Then there's the Holy of Holies within that regular tabernacle, and then there's the heavenly tabernacle, right? So we're going to make a list. So if you didn't mark it, we're just going to walk through chapter 9 together, and we're going to write down what we can discover. Now, I did this on my observation worksheet. We had an extra page in there on the back of chapter 9. So if you want to do it there, or if you want to do it in your notes or whatever, it's always good to make a list of the keywords.
It's just me.
Okay. I'm like,
Almost.
Black us or
it's always good to make a list of what we marked as keywords. So what I have, like I said, is 3 lists. I have the tabernacle, and this would be the Old Testament tabernacle, which we'll discover what else he has to say about that. Then I have the Holy of Holies, which is part of this tabernacle, but it has a very distinct use, so to speak. It's a very distinct place, right? And then the last would be the Heavenly Tabernacle. Okay, so now that we've got that all situated, the hard part for me in studying and preparing to study for this lesson is I didn't want to just draw the tabernacle again. Because we looked at that a bunch of times, right? We know what it looks like, right? But we want to know what the author of Hebrews has to say about it and how he compared it. So that's why we're doing it this way. Okay, so in 9:1, what do we learn about this tabernacle?
It's earthly.
It's earthly, and what is it called there?
Earthly sanctuary?
Yeah, an earthly sanctuary. Okay. Anything else that we see there?
Regulations of divine worship?
Right, so the first covenant was what regulated this tabernacle, right? So it's regulated by the first covenant. Do you see that? The first covenant is doing both. It's just 2 actions. It's regulating divine worship, which is happening also, and it's regulating in the earthly sanctuary. Okay, what else do we find out in verse 2 about this tabernacle?
What's in it?
Okay.
What was prepared?
Okay, so it's prepared.
And then there's an outer one, which leads you to believe there must be an inner one.
One would think.
Okay. It is the outer one. And so he's being very specific of what he's talking about. He's not yet talking about this Holy of Holies, right? This is just what is the outer one. And what's in it?
Lampstands, the table, the showbread.
Sacred
Sacred
bread. And,
It's called the holy place.
okay, and so this all right here is called the holy place. This is 9 verse 2, right? Okay, and then what else do we find out in verse 3?
There's a second veil.
Veil.
Okay, there's a second veil also within this, right? If there's a second, does that tell you there's one?
Must be a first one.
One would think. But then talk.
Okay, did I spell veil right? I always like get
Yes, you
confused.
did.
Okay. Now, staying on just this tabernacle, let's go down to verse 6 and see what it says about it.
The priests continually enter into it.
Okay, so the priests continually enter in. That's 6. And what are they doing there?
Perform divine worship.
Performing divine worship. Now, what regulated the worship? The first covenant. So again, not only what is going on there, but what it looks like, all the details are in that first covenant, which is the law, right?
Right.
Okay. What else do we learn? Let's go down to, by the way, verse 6 also tells us that it's prepared. So you can add that there to the same. What does verse 8 tell us about this tabernacle?
While the outer tabernacle is still standing, the way into the holy place has not yet been disclosed.
Now, which is the holy place?
Behind the second veil.
No,
Is it?
no, it's the,
It's where.
Oh, the Holy of Holies is behind the second veil.
yeah.
Right. Now, what's the holy place? Did he already tell us what the holy
Yes.
place was?
Yeah, it's
It
where
was
they
in our
are.
list.
Yeah, the
It's where
lampstand
this
and
is,
the-
right?
yeah.
Now, let's remember our diagram,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Who goes in here?
The
Who
priest.
goes into
the
this?
priest.
The priest.
The priest. But do all the people go into this place?
No.
No. So the way into just this place, while the tabernacle is still standing, that way is what? What does he call it? Or what does he say about it? While
It's not been disclosed.
Okay, so it's not been disclosed. Now, that's kind of interesting. What do you mean that hasn't been disclosed? Well, how do you get in there? How does one get into the holy place?
Through the priest.
Through the priest, right?
Mhm.
But, so he's saying that that's it, right? No one else gets in there,
No,
right?
no.
So if you want in there, you have to be born into it, right?
right.
You have to be able to get in there by the law. You have to be born into it. Nobody else gets to go, because what happens if you go?
You die.
There's some punishment.
You don't come out.
You don't
Yeah,
come
there's some punishment associated with it. Okay, let's look at verse 9 and see what it says about the tabernacle.
I
This
wonder
is
if anybody
continuing.
ever tried to do that.
I'm sorry?
I wonder if anybody ever tried to go in there and got drug out.
Yes, I feel quite certain.
I feel quite
Yeah.
certain that
There's-
there was a visual
There
there
are
for them.
enough fools in this world. I'm trying to stop using the word stupid and start using the word fool.
Fool,
Yeah,
yeah.
because that's.
Yeah.
Because it's biblical, right?
That's the biblical term.
Although it does imply that I'm meant to have a judging heart, so let's just
Yeah,
not do
let's
that,
But
okay.
isn't the biblical definition though of fool just an unbeliever, not stupid?
Right.
No, well, the word stupid is in the Bible, actually.
Yeah, it
So-
it is, but we just have to be careful
You
about
just
our
have to be
using it,
careful.
right?
Every time I say it, Renee goes, Grandma, you can't say that.
I know, it's a no-no word.
It's a
for us.
no-no word. So is hate, by the way.
Well, until they can understand what they're saying.
That's right.
Okay. 9:8. Okay. Now, what does it say in 9:9? Because it's kind of a continuation of,
It's a symbol for the present time.
right, so that tabernacle is a symbol for the present
yes.
time. Okay. And then I'm running out of room.
Mhm.
But he kind of goes on a tangent. He never does that. He's got a brief word for you. And he goes, and the next place that we find the word tabernacle is in verse 21 of chapter 9. What does it say in verse 21 of chapter 9? Now, you've been making a list on the back of that page.
Right.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if you've lost it, I lost it 3 times while I was writing that. I was like, where's my chapter 9? So I do it too. Okay, so what does he say in verse 21? about
Sprinkled
that.
blood on the tabernacle and the vessels of ministry.
Right, so it was at one point sprinkled with blood. I'm just going to put it right here. Sprinkled with blood by who?
The priest?
Who?
Moses.
By Moses. And this is when the
Oh,
tabernacle
yeah,
was
yeah.
blessed, right? And
Uh-huh.
this is at the inauguration of the first covenant, right? This is when all of that stuff, all that you say we will do, we will do it, right? And we will be obedient. This is that period of time, okay? That's 9:21. And it's sprinkled with blood. What kind of blood?
Blood of cows.
Goats.
And what is it called? That's in a verse before that, but what is, in verse 20, what is it called?
Blood of
Oh,
the
covenant.
covenant.
Yeah, it's the blood of the covenant. And you may not think that's important, but I like details, so there you go. And then, what about in verse 23?
There are copies of the things in the heaven.
Oh, okay, that lets me know something really important. Okay, and what about verse 24?
Christ did not enter into a holy place made with hands. So the tabernacle's made with hands.
It's made with hands, that we could put that next to prepared, right?
Uh-huh.
It's a copy of the true one.
And it is a copy of the true one. Sorry, I know this is just gonna be like word vomit at some certain point. I'm like, oh, this not really a list anymore. Okay, and then it is a mirror copy of the true one. That's verse 24. So this gives us a really good picture. Is it as detailed as what was in the Old Testament? All the details of everything, and did we read that, and do we draw it ourselves, and all of those things, right? But we've started to understand the things that he deems important about this tabernacle, right? Okay, so let's move on and let's make our list for the Holy of Holies. Okay, so we're going to go back to the beginning of chapter 9, and we're going to look for where it's talking about the Holy of Holies. So this may be, depending on how you marked it, it may be another marking for tabernacle. But I would recommend that you maybe mark it more distinctly. Mine are in two brown colors. They're two brown boxes around it, right? But then my heavenly one is blue. So it's all the same thing. It's all a box, but it's just different colors. So it just might help you to, that's just a suggestion. Okay, so let's look at verse 3, where it first mentions this Holy of Holies.
It's behind the second veil.
Okay, so it's behind the second veil. What is it called?
A tabernacle?
It itself is called a tabernacle. That's interesting. And what else? It's called the
Holy of Holies.
Holy of Holies. So that's at the top of our list. You can put that on your list if you want to, but it's the heading of the list. Okay. And then, what does it say about it in verse 4? Because it's continuing this thought of what it is. And verse 4 and 5. What's in there?
An altar of incense.
Okay, so we have a golden altar of incense. That's one thing.
Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant. And just for detail's sake, what's in that?
The jar holding the manna.
Okay, and it's a golden jar of manna.
And
the tablets,
And Aaron's rod, which budded.
Aaron's rod, and we know the story of it budding, and that was how God showed the people, again, because they weren't quite
Convinced?
convinced, I guess. They weren't real
Okay.
happy with this selection, right?
Yeah.
And so he says, I'll show these people. And so this is a symbol of the legitimacy of the Levitical priesthood, right?
And the Ark of the Covenant was golden too. So everything's golden in
Yeah,
there.
everything's golden in there. And that's verse 9, verse 4, just in case you're wanting to keep that. What's in there according to verse 5?
Above it, cherubim of glory, overshadowing the mercy seat.
Okay, so we have another thing that's in there. Now, this is all kind of describing the same thing, right? This is, if you were to look at it, it wouldn't be like there are 3 different things going on.
Mhm.
It would be, this is
Right.
all one piece, right? And we know that from our study of the, I don't want to go over and over what we drew ourselves, okay? Because if you drew it, then you know it. Okay, now, what is said about the Holy of Holies in verse 7?
Only the high priest enters
Once
once a year.
Right, and what does it refer to there in verse 7?
The second?
The second.
So the second tabernacle?
Right, so it would be the
Okay.
second tabernacle.
What?
Because of verse 3, it calls it a tabernacle.
It calls it a tabernacle. And then it says in verse 6, let's just read verse 6.
Oh, okay.
Now, when these things have been so prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer tabernacle, performing the divine worship. But into the second, referring back to a tabernacle, only the high priest enters once a year. So that's another detail, right?
Mhm.
So who gets to go in there?
The high priest.
Only the high priest. And how often?
Once a year.
Once a year.
With blood.
With blood.
Oh, there's more details? Okay. More with blood. And,
Which he offers for himself and the people.
okay, so the blood is offered for himself and for the people.
The sins of the people.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then he goes, I should speak up. He goes off on a tangent a little bit, and then he comes back to talk about the Holy of Holies in verse 23. What does he say about it in verse 23?
That they need to be cleansed with better sacrifices. The things in it.
I'm sorry?
That the things in it need to be cleansed with better sacrifices?
Okay.
I was just thinking about you. I mean, really, what's interesting? Ta-da!
Well, it's referring, it includes, remember how that same verse told us that they were copies? Copies. Copies.
Mm-hmm. Means
What
there's
does that
another
imply?
one.
There's another one.
There's an original.
So this too is a copy, right? It's 2 copies. This one's a copy,
Oh,
and
yeah.
this one's a copy.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Okay, got it.
I don't
Okay,
know where
so
it's at.
it's a copy of what? The things in heaven, right?
Yes.
So this too is a copy of the things in heaven. Sorry, I was. a
No,
little
I
off,
was,
but-
yeah, I
okay.
was out of there.
I was trying to go there with
It
you,
was
but I
me.
was just having a hard time. Okay, so it's a copy, just like this one and the things in it being a copy, this one and the things in it are a copy as well. Now, verse 20, let's see, 25, 24. This is another detail that's the same thing. It's a copy, and how do we get it?
But even in 23, aren't the sacrifices better?
Well, that's referring to which one? Which tabernacle?
The heavenly
Right,
one.
so we haven't gone to that list yet.
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting there. Okay, so verse 23 tells us that the copies of the things in the heavens, so that's what the Holy of Holies is and what the outer tabernacle is as well. And then it says in verse 24, for Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands. So how was this one made?
With hands.
With hands. So that's another detail we can put on there. Okay. And then verse 25. This is kind of reiterating something that he's already said, but what does it say in verse 25 about this Holy of Holies, the holy place? It's, first of all, it's called the holy place, right? Was it this one called the holy place? Did you get a little bit confused?
I still am.
I don't have a real explanation for you, because he does call out this as the holy place. But then here in verse 25 refers to this as the holy place. And he's very specific, and we know that he's talking about this place, because what else is he saying in verse 25?
The high priest
once a
enters.
year.
Okay, so we know that this holy place, I forgot how to write here. Let's see, this holy place, 9:25, is only the high priest enters once a year. So this is the same thing that was said here. This was 9, I forgot to do my markings.
25.
What was it before that?
7.
7. Okay, so 9, 7, and 25. He does that once a year. That's 9, 7, and 25. Okay.
With blood.
And with blood, that's 9, 7. And is there another detail that he offers about
Not
that
his
blood?
own blood.
I know, isn't that
Right,
interesting?
right. So that's the last little detail about that blood that he brings in, that it's offered for himself and for the people for their sins, but it's not his own.
Right. That's key.
That is key. Okay, so we've got a really good idea of not only this outer tabernacle, which is called the holy place, but now this inner or second tabernacle, which is called the Holy of Holies. So let's now look at the heavenly one, right? And let's write down the details there. Do you see where that's mentioned for the first time in chapter 9?
11.
In verse 11. And what does it say in verse 11?
Perfect, more perfect tabernacle. Greater, yeah.
Greater.
Okay, so
Right.
first it's greater, and it's also more perfect. And it's called a tabernacle, which we put in our title, but if you wanted to, you could put it there. What else does it say in verse 11?
Not made with hands.
Oh, well, those were, but this one's not.
Well, and Christ entered into this one
Oh, that's important.
as high priest.
Yeah.
Now, what would have happened if he had entered into this one?
Well, it's hard to believe that he would have died.
Yeah.
It really wasn't.
Yeah.
Because according to the law, he would have broken the law, and he should have been killed as a result of it, right? So, I mean, for him to enter this one, he'd already be dead, right? He'd be dead here, and then somehow if he ran through that one and got to this one, he'd be dead there too, right?
Yes.
If this was just on earth, and
Right.
if this was just according to the law. Because what regulates this and this.
The genealogy.
The-
The first
first
covenant, right? The first covenant, which set up the Levitical priesthood, which did all of those things. And so we know, and he has talked about, that he's not according to the line, right? He's not a
Right.
Levite. He's according to the tribe of Judah. But he's been made high priest. How? How was he made high priest?
Called by God.
By God. He's
The order of
appointed
Melchizedek.
according to the order of Melchizedek, and it's by a promise or by an oath. He says, I swore that you are a son and you are a priest forever, according to the, and we've already gone over how he's a better priest, but this is, again, this is where he's doing it, right? So this is where he enters into. It's not this one, and it's not this one. He enters into the heavenly tabernacle, so that's a huge detail, right? Okay, and then what else do we find out?
Not of this creation.
Okay, so it's kind of a detail here, right? So it's not made with hands, and it's not of this creation. Okay, and then Jesus is Christ, enters into this one as what?
High priest.
Wow, there's a lot of detail about that in just this one verse, right? What about verse 12?
He brought his own blood, not blood of goats.
Right, and remember that other verse that said that the priest doesn't bring his own blood?
Right.
Well, here we have Jesus as a high priest
Yeah.
bringing his
His
own
own.
blood into this heavenly tabernacle. So he comes in not through what?
Blood of those goats.
But through his blood. What is it called here in verse 12?
Holy place.
The holy place. But I thought we already had a holy place. I thought we already had two holy places.
Well, this is a greater and more perfect
This
one.
is a greater and more perfect one, right? This one's different. Now, what detail do we have there in verse 12 about him entering into this holy place? Besides it being through his blood, it's also
Once and for all.
once for all. That's once, one time, for all time, right? Now, again, he goes off on a little tangent, and he talks about some other things, which we'll talk about next week. And then he comes back to it in verse 23. What does he have to say about the heavenly tabernacle in verse 23?
Better sacrifices than these. Cops.
Well, it requires a better sacrifice than the earth.
The things in it needed to be cleansed with better sacrifices.
Right, and what are they? The things in the heavens. So that's the name of it, right? We're trying to just basic. So the next thing is, what it's called is the things in the heavens. Now, let's
Well, and that what we had on earth were copies of those.
right. And so we have facsimiles here, right?
Right.
And so I'm going to put copied on earth.
You know, that was such a revelation, not this year, in the past, when it finally hit me, when I finally realized that what they had already existed in heaven. I somehow, when I can remember that,
Yeah.
that kind of light bulb, it was like, oh my.
Right, and it's so interesting because other religions
Mm.
have such strange
Yeah.
creations
Yeah.
of worship, right?
Yeah.
They have such weird regulations, things that, their holy books or whatever, that then come up with these weird rituals and come up with these weird places that you have to worship. And it's like, okay, well, I guess apparently the Jews just decided where they're going to have a weird place and weird regulations, but no.
No.
It was
Yeah.
according to the pattern
Yeah.
that Moses was shown. And so then Moses goes and he writes down, this is how it's done,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
In an earthly sense, right?
Yeah.
And so it's mere copies or mere
Yeah.
shadow
Yeah.
of what he had already seen, right? He sees them.
Yeah.
He saw this. This existed elsewhere. It's just miraculous. And yes, it is one of those like,
Yeah.
wow moments, right?
That was timely. That was timely.
That is so funny. Okay, so let's see. Let's read that verse 23. Therefore, it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these. But the heavenly things themselves. Now, what does it say to be cleansed with these? What is it saying?
Blood,
The blood of what?
animals.
Of bulls and goats, right? And so, but in contrast, the heavenly things, the things in the heavens, the heavenly things, right? With what?
Better
sacrifices.
Okay, so
Than the blood.
these things are cleansed.
How do the heavenly things need to be cleansed?
Ah,
Satan-
good
didn't
question.
Satan defile heaven?
Absolutely, he
I think
did.
Satan defiled heaven.
Really?
Well, that's my take.
That is true, and he failed.
Wouldn't that be an interesting thing
That would be
to
very
really
interesting.
dig deep
Yeah.
on? Again, we didn't have the time to
Yeah.
really dig deep, but
Has
yeah,
Troy digged into
because I
that?
do wonder
Yes.
that too.
Troy definitely has.
Okay.
But then what is it cleansed with?
Better
Jesus' blood.
Yeah.
Right, the
Yeah.
better sacrifice, and the better
Right.
sacrifice is what?
Jesus.
Is
Yeah.
Jesus and his blood, right? And, okay, so I'm just gonna keep reading. The heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Verse 24. For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands. So, is that referring to this one? A holy place made with hands?
No.
No, and Jesus didn't enter there, right?
Right.
We already know that he didn't
Right.
enter that. A mere copy of the true one. So what does it say there
It's a true one.
that we can add to our list?
Oh,
It is
it's
the
true.
true one.
Yeah.
The true one. That's 9:24. Am I in the right verse? Yes. But into what?
Heaven.
Heaven itself. So would that be what this is referring to? Is that another detail? Wow, we are discovering something amazing. He entered into a true tabernacle that these were mere copies of. And what is that true tabernacle?
Heaven.
Itself. So exciting. Okay, now to appear in the presence of God for us. So, what detail would we put there?
Presence of God is there. God is there.
Right,
Present.
and Jesus is appearing before him on,
For us.
for his sake?
For us.
No, for us. So it is in the presence. I mean, this is where we're talking about serious holy ground, right? The presence of God and Christ appears before him for us.
Thank you.
Are you, I know it's kind of one of those, it's not like a list can be holy. But are you
Yes.
Yeah,
are you
yeah.
getting how deep this is?
Yeah.
Because we're getting into the minutia, that this is holy. This is amazing stuff that's going on here. So, we can sit back and worship when we think about this holy place that Christ has entered into in the presence of God to appear for us. He's brought his own blood. to cleanse, so that we don't have to bring in the blood of bulls and goats. We don't have to bring in lesser sacrifices. We have the better sacrifice in himself, and he appears for us. Oh, it's so exciting. Okay.
And you know, I think it overwhelms me in that we could not just get this without the history of this.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's why God gives it to them. And that's what I'm saying. You know, we get this idea somehow that, and it is said in a lot of extra biblical things, that the Jews came up with this system of worship. No. It is not the invention of man.
No.
It is a man who saw something completely real and then said, and was instructed, go and make something that looks like this. Go and tell these people so that they have some idea, so that when I continue to reveal myself, as I will, they will understand. Isn't that just miraculous? We have something so much better than the lost have, you know, because they're just aiming and hitting and missing, and aiming and hitting and missing. And yet we have what we can have, a perfect sacrifice, a perfect mediator, a perfect high priest who goes into the heavens. We don't miss. We don't ever miss. He's there before the presence of God for us. It's so exciting. Yes. Okay. So, you know how I get all excited and just say the word awesome over and over. So let's. Okay, so he is in heaven itself. He's entered into the presence of God. Let me make sure that we got there. Verse 24, Christ in the Okay, into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Verse 25, nor was it that he would offer himself often, as the high priest enters the holy place year by year with blood that is not his own. So what does that tell us about?
It's once and for all.
Right, it's that once and for all, which we already saw in verse 12. So we can put that here too. That's 9:25. So you can just add that in there. That, just to solidify that this is a once for all thing. Okay, so I ask this kind of facetiously. Which one's better? Right?
Yeah.
And which one are we able to enter? Yeah, how?
Through Jesus.
Through
It's
Jesus.
amazing.
This is the only one that we get to enter. Now remember, over here, that while this one's there, the way into the holy place is not disclosed.
Right.
What was disclosed as the way into the holy place, into the true holy place? Christ. This is the only way, right? And so we just pass over all of this because this becomes obsolete, right? We don't need the copies when we have the real thing, right? When we have the real, this just passes away. This is not even important. And of course, it's not even there right now, although it will be brought back.
Yeah.
But we're looking to this, right? And so our author of Hebrews, he's got these people that he's writing to, right? And they are tempted to go back to this, right? And so he lays it out in chapter 9. You don't need all this. We have the true one. So eyes back on Jesus, eyes back on the heavenly, eyes back on the true things. Let's lay all this aside because everything has been revealed as being, this is the truth. So it's really exciting. Now,
You know, it's hard. I don't know how everyone else grew up, but I grew up in a church. I was taught certain doctrine, and I became a believer at 31, and I started studying and learned the truth. And but that was ingrained in my brain. And so I would be studying, I would have it down, the truth, and then I'd go back. And when I went back, then I would have to go revisit because that doctrine is so ingrained and it's taught so well. And I'm sure for this, which was a copy, and it was the real deal for them, it would be such a temptation.
Right.
They had to revisit often, okay, now get my eyes back on Jesus, get back to
Right.
the truth, because that would be so tempting with all the other people saying, no, this is, stay here, stay here.
Right, and he is constantly saying, this is better, right?
Mhm.
It's not that there was anything wrong, right?
Mhm.
That's not wrong,
Right.
except for now that we have Jesus,
Mhm.
we don't need those things, right? All those things are becoming obsolete. All of that's passing away.
Mhm.
And indeed, there will come a time for these people when that is not even there,
That's
right?
right.
That temple made with hands is not there.
Mhm.
And so he's saying, get your eyes on Jesus.
Right.
Get your eyes on the author and perfecter of your faith. And so,
But, I understand
Yeah.
the whole struggle in this, because this is
Sure.
tangible.
It
Sure.
is.
This
Yes,
is tangible,
it
and there
is.
is security in what is
Mhm.
tangible and what we know, and the same thing, with the way you grew up. So, it's a matter of letting go and living by faith.
Mhm.
And praise God, He's given us the true word,
Mhm.
enough evidence that has come to pass
Yeah.
that we can trust
That's
what
right.
we cannot yet
Yeah.
hold on to.
right, right. And so as this is just kind of be a summation of what we've looked at in the book of Hebrews. So we have determined with the author of Hebrews that Jesus is the present and final way that God speaks to man. That was chapter 1.
Mhm.
That he's better than angels. That's chapters 1 and 2. That he's the perfect man and the Son of God. Chapter 2. He's worthy of more glory than Moses as a son, not as a servant over the house of God, but as a son in the house of God. That's chapter 3. That he is our perfect and merciful high priest. That was chapter 4. That he is appointed priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. That was chapter 5. That he is, according to the promises of God, a hope both sure and steadfast, because it's according to the promises of God. And that's chapter 6. That he is the guarantee of a better covenant. He is able to save us forever. And he's able to save those who draw near to him, near to God through him. That's chapter 7. That he is the mediator of that better covenant. And that's chapter 8. That he has entered into the real, better, and more perfect tabernacle. That's verse 9. Do you see how he has just been bringing us along to where we get a big, huge dose of who Jesus is, right? I mean, it's the deeper things of God where we're just, look at him, worship him, right? There's nothing else, just everything else just fade away. It's all about Jesus. It's so exciting. And next week, we're going to look at the sacrifice that he offered to see if we think it's better too, right? I have a feeling. Spoiler alert, that we're going to think it's a better sacrifice, but we're really going to dig into this sacrifice. So we now know the where, right? We now know where all of this happens. And so next week, we're going to find out what's happening in that place. Okay?